Thank you so much for joining us this evening. I'm Hiroki Ueno, chairing this session. Today, as a speaker of the fifth EAIHN online seminar, which means the East Asian Intellectual History Network, fifth EAIHN online seminar, as a speaker of the fifth EAIHN online seminar through the auspices of the EAA of the University of Tokyo, we had Dr. Anne Brunon-Ernst, who is a professor at the Université Paris, Panthéon-Assas in France. Currently, she is also a visiting fellow at Australian National University, which fortunately provides us to invite her to deliver a paper for us. Actually, the title of her paper today, Penitentiaries in the British Empire, the case of Panopticon prisons in Australia, suits today's seminar perfectly, which is entitled The Trans-Pacific Perspective on the British Empire. Before moving on to Professor Brunon-Ernst's talk, let me just explain the implication of this title just briefly. So I would like to suggest 2 points. The first one is about the relationship between Enlightenment and Empire. As is mentioned at the beginning of Anna's shared paper with us in advance, recent scholarship in modern intellectual history has paid so much attention to the so-called imperial dimension of Enlightenment thought and practice in relation to, what is called global history or imperial history. Although their main focus, tends to be rather the 19th and 20th centuries. So, as Anna's paper mentions, recent literature in the field includes Jennifer Pitt's A Turn to Empire, Sankamutu's edited volume, Empire and Modern Political Thought, and David Armitage's The Ideological Origins of the British Empire. I suppose many of us are intellectual and cultural historians based in East Asia, exchanging ideas in the hope of establishing a pan-Asian and trans-Pacific intellectual platform. And while many of the network members are experts of the European Enlightenment or American Enlightenment, we are also interested in their positive and negative impacts on East Asia, including the so-called Western impact. So this kind of global and imperial context is something which we could not avoid when studying Enlightenment Europe in Asia, in East Asia. Of particular interest to me is the colonies as a kind of laboratory in which Enlightenment utopias were experimented with by the British and other European empires. Perhaps their radical and utopian experiments that could not be put into trial in the old world, in their mother countries, where customs and traditions were still alive and, amalgamated with modernity considerably. Just personally, this reminds me of, Rebecca Solnit's idea of disaster utopia to some extent. But anyway, and secondly, the global situation with the disciplinary power and biopolitics in our contemporary world, particularly after the current global pandemic. So this global situation makes our theme even more crucial, I suppose. And in this context, one of my personal interests is in the various models of Enlightenment sociability and their cultural transfers, which are circulated beyond Europe, that is in its colonial empires. I think that the installing project of the Panopticon in the British settlers' colonies is a crucial subject. This subject enables us to further understand how the West attempted to control, regulate, and sometimes enhance human micro-interaction in their colonies. And their concerns with the regulation and production of micro-interaction of human beings doesn't seem to be restricted only to the penitentiaries as closed or how to say exclusive spaces. Rather, the scope reaches the colonial societies in general, I suppose. The confinement or confinement has been a key word of last year worldwide, which also closely relates to the issue of sociability and unsociability as well. So the circulation and the transfers of the panoptic system in the imperial world is definitely worthy of discussion in this network in terms of actuality as well as historic significance. So, okay, so could you get started, Anne, with your talk whenever you are ready?
Yes, thank you very much, Dr. Ueno, for the invitation to speak and at this 5th EAIHN seminar. Thank you also very much for the introduction. I hope I will live up to your expectations. I would also like to thank Professor KAINO and Dr. CHEN for accepting to discuss my work today. As always, money is the key, and I would like to thank the ScPo Law School for funding the research and Bentham's research through the POC Bentham funding grant. This research has also been carried out as part of a fellowship, as Dr. Ueno mentioned, at the Centre for Law, Arts and the Humanities at the EAIHN College of Law, which I now wish to thank. Although this is an online seminar, I am speaking from a real location in Australia, and therefore, as it is customary in Australia, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we meet today, and I would like to pay my respects to elders past and present. My seminar presentation comments and builds upon the papers of Tim Kozer, Adam Ford, Rachel Hurst, Emily Landman, David Levlin, and Glenn Stasiuk. And these papers were presented in the latest special issue in the Revue d'études benthamiennes on panopticons in Australia. And I wish here to acknowledge the work that they did and the way in which I have inspired myself from these papers to write the present paper. It is work which is still in progress, as this issue of the Revue d'études benthamiennes is a continuous issue. This means that papers will be added on different other penal settlements, the one in Port Macquarie, Newcastle, Moreton Bay, and the Sydney Barracks, as well as on issues and themes that had not been dealt with in the first installment on female convicts, for example. And we are hoping to be able to publish contribution by Hamish Maxwell Stewart, Lucy Frost, and Brian Walsh, among others, next year in that continuous issue. The title of my talk today has slightly changed. It is now Migration, Punishment, and the British Empire, Panopticon Prisons in Australia. I'll basically be dealing with the same issue that I had aimed to cover with the previous title. I'm just trying to be slightly more precise with my topic. There are things that I will not deal with, and among which I will not deal in particular with Bentham's writing on the Panopticon. I will not be examining them during this presentation. I will not go into Bentham's discussion on the comparative benefits of Panopticon prisons over transportation that he expounded in Panopticon versus New South Wales. I will not look into Bentham's indictment of the colonies or their praise, both in Rid Yourself of your Colonies and Colonization Proposal. And I will not look into Bentham's writing on international law and the discussion around cosmopolitan law. I am very happy to discuss these issues together with you after, but that's not the purpose of my talk right now. My starting point is Redfield's indictment or statement of penal colonies as anti-panopticism on account of the spatial logic, the politics of visibility, and the hybrid form of disciplines that can be found in penal colonies. And to a certain extent, it is this tension, this opposition between incarceration and excarceration that I would like to study today. And what I am trying to show is that it is rather about incarceration in excarceration, or immobility within mobility. My presentation today is going to be quite straightforward. Part one is going to be on, I will be discussing contextual elements dealing with what I call penal mobility, and that is the theme of transportation in the British Empire. And in part two, I will look at the theme of what I call penal immobilization, more particularly in the case of Australia, looking at Panopticon prisons in the penal colony. As a conclusion, or to conclude, I will try to reassess the characterization of birth of the prison by Foucault, and to see to what extent the study of the Panopticons in Australia can help to reassess the characterization of Foucault. At the outset, I've used the term global, but I think we're all aware of it. By global, I mean global history, and I define global history as the study of historical facts shaped by cross-cultural interaction and adopted by many nations. And it is within the context of global history that I wish to investigate the Panoptic features of penitentiaries in Australia. I'm going to move on to my first part, which is on penal mobility and looking into transportation in the British Empire. Now, what is transportation? Transportation is understood as a form of punitive relocation. It is a very old legal tool in the hands of communities. Now, while transportation of convicts in its modern form appeared in 1415 in the hands of the Portuguese Empire, it shares common features with older forms of displacement, such as exile, indentured servitude, and sale into slavery, which were used among others, by the Greek, the Romans in the antiquity, but also in ancient and more recent part of Africa and Asia. Let's move closer to our time in the 17th, 18th, and 19th century. Transportation coexisted with other means of punishment: the prisons, the galleys, the hulks, and the workhouses. As its competitors, transportation aimed to punish and extract labor. And I think these are really the two most important terms: punishment and extraction of labor. However, it had an advantage, transportation had an advantage about other forms, as it also helped to manage excess population and helped the imperial expansion. Indeed, from its modern beginnings, transportation was used as an efficient tool to implement the European expansionary imperial project. And it was used also as a means to colonize distant possession, prevent rival occupation, incapacitate dissent at home, tackle crime at home, and all that thanks to the settlement and labor of convicts. Now, it is far marginal, it is far from being marginal, this state-enforced migration of people. As you can see from the first slide that I have here, the first map that I have here in this slide, over the period of colonization, that means from the Renaissance up to the end of World War II, the sheer number of people displaced is mind-boggling. Australia, if you include Van Diemen's Land, Tasmania, and mainland Australia, amounts for the largest number of displaced people at around 160,000. But you also have a lot of displaced people in the Andaman Islands in Asia, which was one of the greatest hubs of transportation for the Asian continent. The numbers of people displaced were through transportation routes. And this second map is of interest because it actually highlights the circuits, the networks, the flows that take place between the metropole and the colonial outposts. Now, this is what is to be expected. However, if you look slightly closer to these routes, you will see some circulation and flow of convicts from between colonial outposts. So from the Caribbeans to Australia, for example, or from Asia down to Australia, routes that go through the Cape Colony also, and then end in Australia. So it's particularly interesting to have a look at these various flows and transport routes. From these first considerations, we can state that A, transportation is a global phenomenon, and B, that it is multi-directional. It deals with flows of human beings, goods, services, and ideas. And I'll come back to that statement that it deals with flows of human beings, goods, services, and ideas. And it does so according to predefined circuits. The one which interests us more particularly is the one that takes you from England, Scotland, Ireland, down to Cape Colony, and then to Australia. This highlights, in fact, a continuum of mobility all through from the antiquity to the contemporary era. And the serial displacement of course, part of migration history more than just convict history understood in a more circumscribed manner. If you look at Australia, and I'm going to skip to another later slide, in Australia, you have three areas which were used as penal colonies. You had New South Wales from 1788 to 1840, and these are the elements which are defined as the Cockatoo, the Sydney Barracks, the Cockatoo Island area there, government house there. You have Van Diemen's Land or Tasmania from 1803 to 1854, with a certain number of sites which are given there and listed. So you have the Darlington Probation Station, Port Arthur, you've got the Cascade Female Factory, you've got the coal mines, and you have in Western Australia the Swan River colony with Fremantle, and then we'll also see later on a certain number of islands on the side. So Western Australia was used as a penal, parts of Western Australia was used as a penal colony from between 1850 and 1868. And of course there's Norfolk Island, which administratively actually belonged to, was supervised by New South Wales, if I am not mistaken. Now, if we go back to the previous slide, this one, the one that highlights the flow or the circulation and the mobility of people across the world over a very large period of time, which is up to 1875 in this particular slide. You see and you can understand what are the flow not only of convicts, but also of settlers, overseers, government officers, soldiers, naval officers, which accompany and constitute the administrative backbone of the penal colony. And a certain number of things or elements of this, or major elements of this circulation of people need to be highlighted. The first thing is Governor Phillip, the first governor of New South Wales, had previous experience of conveying convicts for the Portuguese. He was also a naval officer with previous experience of working and operating on various routes in the British Empire. You have it's quite also significant that governors of New South Wales were actually drawn from the ranks of the Navy, who had prior experience of circulation and flows of people, merchandises in the empire. In the special issue, in the introduction, I mentioned John Thomas Bigg, who was a former judge in Trinidad, who also headed the inquiry into the judicial establishments of New South Wales and Van Diemen's Land in 1819, 1821, and then was appointed at the Commission of Inquiry investigating the governance of the Cape Colony in 1823. That's another instance of all these movements of civil servants, administrators, naval officers around the colonies, and the way in which they circulate their own ideas of how the colonies and the British Empire has to be managed. And of course, the example and given within both the introduction to the special issue, but also Tim Causer's paper on Alexander McHonaghy, on the management of the Norfolk Island penal settlement. It also happens that Alexander McHonaghy, I'm sorry for the pronunciation, was also the inventor of the mark system, which had a widely copied as a penitentiary regime across the British Empire. He also made proposal for convicts to undertake harbour improvement in South Africa in the province of Natal. So these are just three instances of circulation of administrators within the British Empire and the way in which they actually take their ideas from one part to another of the empire. Ideas also circulate in various ways, and here, of course, what I'm interested in is had people read, what all these administrators, officials have read, even people who were convicts but who were literate and might have been exposed to ideas on penal reform. What are the ideas or the expectations that they had as British as to both their rights, the way in which the prison system, a penitentiary system, operated in England, and the way in which they expected their rights to be upheld also in the colony. So the circulation of ideas is based on people's memories, people's books, the journals, and the way in which reviews, compilations, discussions, and the way people had access to these ideas. There's a whole host of penal reformists at that time. And of course, you've got the previous generation with Beccaria, Howard, Eden, and you have Bentham also at the end of the period. In the 19th century, you've got Tocqueville and Beaumont, French penal reformer who went to the US and to explore and to report on the prison system and the innovation of the prison system in the US. You have in the US practitioners, John Haviland, Elsan, Linser, Cray. You have, of course, Romy in the UK. But also penal practitioners such as Crawford, Whitworth, Russell, Jed, Chadwick, John Clay, Elizabeth Fry, and the debate that takes place in Britain between the advocates of the silent system and the separate system. So all these things are both ideas that would, to which prison warden, prison managers would have been exposed without necessarily being able to pinpoint the name of the proponent of this or that idea. So these were ideas that were in circulation, and people would just like pick and choose them in order to then decide upon a course of action. Circulation of ideas, circulation of people and convicts, of course, because that is the main commodity that is being flowed around or moved around the empire. Now, a convict is a term, it has a very special definition. It is an enforced social definition, which is at the crossroads of both the commodification of labor, that is, that the convict is the carrier but not the possessor of his own labor, and also a legal definition, which is that thanks to or through the act of a court of law, the individual forfeited his right to be free. So at the crossroads of both the idea, the economic idea of the commodification of labor and the legal consequence of a judicial decision, you have the convict. And this commodification is overseen by authorities under a certain, within a certain administrative or legal framework. Things do not, are not completely outside any legal parameters. In Australia, traditionally convicts would be considered as male city dweller from London or any other industrial city in Britain, sentenced for transportation for theft. So mainly males, and that's created a certain homosociality. Now, lately, there has been some very interesting work as to which allows us to reconsider who is the convict in Australia at the time. The first element of interest, and that also relates to the map that we have here of the movement and flow of convicts, is race. All convicts were not white. There is evidence that there are 150 convicts from the British Caribbean colonies who were transported to Australia between 1821 and 1837. You also have to remember that the indigenous inhabitants, original inhabitants of Australia, were taken as convicts, and they also make up part of the convict population within Australia. They do not necessarily belong to these flows, that the international flows or global flows of convicts from the metropolis to Australia, but you also have to take into account the internal flows of Aboriginal populations within the same region or from one part of Australia up to another part of Australia, but we'll have the opportunity of talking about this. They were used as slave labor in Queensland, for example, but also a very clear pattern of incarceration in on island. And let me show you this slide here. And you have, for example, a certain number of islands which are given here, such as Flinders Island, which was an island on which, rather than transported, we could say deported. Aboriginals were deported and partly left to die. Following the taking over of Tasmania by European settlers. And if you look at the Fremantle area, which is in Western Australia, you see you've got two islands, Coronet Island and Rottnest Island. Now, Coronet Island was the first island that was used to transport Aboriginal convicts exclusively, and then this island was closed and the convicts were deported or transported to Rottnest Island, another island exclusively made for or used by Aboriginal convicts. Aboriginal convicts were displaced from all parts of Australia and taken to that particular island, Rottnest Island. I said earlier on that the traditional convict was sentenced for transportation for theft, and generally the idea is that they were petty criminals. The first thing is to note is that there were also 1,000 political convicts, so that was a way of managing dissent at home, to deport a certain number of political convicts to the colonies and to penal colonies. And there is also a reassessment of who was sent to the penal colonies and to Australia, and it is now assessed that it did understood that it was not what was usually considered as the, between inverted commas, the scum of Britain, but rather a working class aristocracy, as convicts displayed above average both literacy skills and trade skills. We said that the typical convict was male, and there were 15% female convicts, which created a gender imbalance, and which also caused sexual violence against, and was the cause of sexual violence against Aboriginal women. Culture. These people, these convicts, had managed to carve out their own cultural and social space that was distinct from the culture in their original country. And there are instances of this syncretic culture taking place as from the voyage. So the flow itself, the transport itself, the route itself was instrumental in creating a particular identity and it was not so much the origin of the convict which was important as the boat in which they had been transported, the friendships and connections that they would make within the ship during the voyage, and that would then be instrumental in developing their social life once arrived on the colony. Lately also, a lot of studies have looked at the issue of convict resistance and dissent, and shown that the importance of convict agency, and the fact that they were not only passive receptacles of authority and imperial authority. Hard labor, that's extremely important too. There was a very wide disparity. Now, you think about transportation as a system, but on the ground there was a very big disparity depending on your skills, the boat you were in, where you were sent to. You were either, you would the range of position would go from skilled workers retained by government or assigned to a private employer, or road and chain gangs for building infrastructures, or working on penal station with or without a reoffending sentence, or even management positions in the government or on stations such as clerks or constables. So a wide range of experiences when you were a convict. It's not a one-size-fits-all experience. Slavery is also a very important concept, and which is also part of that circulation, comparing circulation of circulation of convicts in the British Empire and the circulation of slaves within the British Empire, the way in which that comparison has been instrumental in the 18th century already, at the beginning of 18th century, to try and argue against transportation, highlighting how inhumane the situation of convicts were as it was compared to that of slaves. This is one of the legacy of the utilitarians, for example. Another important concept also is that of settler society. Now, settlerism is a concept that was coined by James Bellish, and settlerism designate the ideology which in the 19th century legitimized territorial expansion and indigenous dispossession combined with population migration, thus creating racially stratified societies. Now, how do convicts fit in that conversation? Well, very simply because there has been traditionally two stances around convicts. The first one was to exempt them from any blame in colonial occupation and indigenous dispossession, because they had been dispossessed themselves. They had been taken to Australia against their will. However, the latest studies, as I say earlier on, emphasizing convict agency, actually blame convicts for the active part they played in the dispossession, displacement, and death of Aboriginals. And Claire Anderson, who is one of the greatest global historians of transportation, states, convicts occupy a rather ambivalent position in the history of empire building, for they were both colonized and colonizers, repressed and repressive, settlers and evictors. Which brings me to my second part, another ambiguity and the ambiguous position of the Panopticon within mobility and immobility. I'm looking at penal immobilization. Now, Yeah, I'll take this slide. Sorry. A little bit of history. When the first fleet arrives in Australia, it is full of convicts, but of course it arrives on land that is not built, where basic infrastructures need to be built, and there was no physical possibility of housing the convicts within a built structure or within a prison. There was the first emergency was to build storage for food, and the government house, for example, but the priority of the authorities was not to build prisons. So this was an outdoor penitentiary whereby prisoners or convicts would work for the government or for a farmer when free settlers arrived later on, and would sleep in their own huts in the evening. So there's a great amount of freedom. And all of a sudden, from the 1820s, there is a shift in paradigm and a push towards an indoor penal regime, whereby structures will be built to house convicts, at least at night, and they would not be free to go back to their own homes. There are two reasons for that shift. The first is purely structural. The second one is ideological. Structural because in order to be able to build prison, you need a sufficiently structured administrative network, which is capable of overlooking both the building and the running of prisons. And that, of course, was not possible in the very early times of the colonies. The second reason is ideological, and there again, it is the turning point is the big report, and more particularly what he wrote in Directions for the New Settlements. He actually advocated for separation between settlers and convicts, and that separation meant that there was a classification or a gradation of offences that would lead to being internally transported. And internal transportation would be reserved for the most heinous crimes, and that you would have a network of lesser local penitentiaries for lesser crimes. So you have a whole penal network which is set up, with the colony itself being a penal colony, and within that penal colony, depending on the type of offence you were convicted of in the metropole, and depending on whether or not you had reoffended, you would then be sent either to local penitentiaries, such as the Parramatta Female Factory, the Hyde Park Barracks, the Sydney Jail, or you would be sent to secondary places of punishment, such as Port Arthur, for example. You have attempts from the 1820s to systematize and to create a hierarchy of punishment. Now, there had always been a hierarchy of punishment before the 1820s, but it wasn't able to be implemented in as systematic a way, because there was not that network of prisons to house and to discipline the convicts. So before the 1820s, you always had ways of punishing the convicts for minor infringements of rules, such as diminishing the food rations, diminishing their freedom, or physical punishment, such as lashes. You always had the possibility of reassigning the convict to a more difficult, more strenuous, more hard labor, such as the road or the chain gang, or you always had the possibility of sending them to penal station outside at the outskirts of the new colony. And Norfolk Island had partly been used as a penal station, that is a place of secondary punishment for those who had reoffended, such as also, as you can see here, the islands in the Sydney Harbour. Cockatoo Island is a place of secondary punishment after the closure of Norfolk Island, but you have also Pinchgut Island, which was used as from 1788 as a place of secondary punishment. Secondary punishment also is Port Arthur in Tasmania. Notwithstanding these various attempts at classifying, separating, and isolating convict population, if you look in practice, for example, at Port Arthur and the way in which convicts were isolated, even though they might be sleeping or housed in different areas on the penal station of Port Arthur, you still had, working at the same place, skilled laborer that was sent from Hobart to help out with very specific skilled positions within the Port Arthur penal station. You had re-offending convicts, and you had also convicts who had committed particularly heinous crimes, who had been sent directly from the metropole to the colony. And within Port Arthur itself, you had your own classification of jobs that you would carry out depending on either your skills or the type of offense you had committed, or the re-offending instances all through your stay, both in the colony and in the penal station. Now, all these disciplinary elements, separation, proportionate sentence, you have a sentence that is proportionate to the offense, ideas of laboring and enforcing labor for all the convicts, the idea of controlling the work that is done, all this can be found already in Bentham's writing, but in many other pieces of writing at the time. The idea of proportionate sentences already in Beccaria. The idea of separation is something that is advocated by John Howard in the 1770s. You have all the discussion in the debate between the advocate of the silent system and the separate system about type of separation, whether the separation is physical or people are in fact together, but they are separate because they cannot communicate. The idea of labor, to what extent the labor is actually productive or not, labor as a form of reformation, as an economic purpose, or just labor as a form of punishment with the treadwheel, which was being pushed around for no other aim than punishing, making the convict work and be punished at the same time. That is in the metropole. Now, work carried out on the in the colony is work that contributes to developing the economy of the colony. Now, I've talked about the Panopticon many times so far, and I haven't described it. Now, I assume that most of you know what are the Panoptic features of the Panopticon. It's a circular building from which the inmates in the cells can be watched by the overseer or the overseers positioned in a central tower. And this is basic idea of Bentham's asymmetric panoptic power gaze, and it can be used to many different users: workers, convict, paupers, students, and even civil servants. Now, here in the in Australia, what we're looking at is the use of the Panopticon prison as applied to convicts. Now, as I discussed previously, we have to make the difference between the pre-1820s and the post-1820s. Now, before 1820, there were very few built penitentiaries. And therefore, if you do not have a built structure, you will not have a panoptic architecture. So the only way in which you can actually investigate the panoptic features is not through architecture before the 1820s, but only through discipline and the disciplinary elements put into place to control the convicts. Now, you do have to understand that contrary to a square building with 4 walls and a roof, the type of building that you see here on that slide, the Panopticon requires, or a panoptic-like building requires, a very developed form of government in order to build this type of building, one of which is the cost, and in an element, in an environment with very limited resources in terms of money, in terms of manpower, in terms of building material, building something that goes beyond only the simple housing of individual, to have a purpose within for the people who are being housed within that structure, requires a very developed state, which was maybe not mature enough before the 1820s. After the 1820s, you start with a new regime, and the best way of actually separating people and enforcing that regime of separation is through closed structures. So I've been talking for the last 20 minutes or so, or 30 minutes, and I am going to disappoint you by saying that, in fact, there are no Panopticon as such in Australia. Not at least to the extent that you will find them, for example, in Cuba, or that you can find them in the UK or in the US. Now, first thing I want to note is the fact that contemporaries all around the British Empire and all around the European colonies have used the term Panopticon to describe a new penal architecture or a new penitentiary regime. And this is the case in Lima in Peru, where a new prison was built in 1862, and it wasn't built according to Bentham's principle directly. It was built according to the principle of the Auburn prison, and we're absolutely sure of that because people who actually decided and implemented the building of the prison actually went to the US to visit these prisons and came back with the ideas. And this prison, which was built according to a competing system, was called by the locals El Panoptico. So here, the Panopticon is not so much referring to Bentham's Panopticon, it refers to a system, a new enhanced system of a regime of surveillance within a prison, which is enhanced by the architecture in Bentham's Panopticon, but also in other types of prison. Now, I also saw, and maybe Japanese colleagues in the conference today can help us, that in Kajibashi in Japan, somebody called Owahara Shigeshika laid out a blueprint for the Kajibashi prison based on Bentham's Panopticon. I wasn't able to find more information than that, but I thought that that was also an interesting point to highlight. Also maybe the circulation of ideas in very different cultures of these panoptic ideas and what the Panopticon stands for in different cultures. Now, what are the panoptic features that we are going to identify to determine whether a building or a structure or a regime is panoptic? I think that there are 5 that we can use, and I am going to, yes, okay. There is the purpose-oriented use of space. So space is used with a purpose. So we're no longer in the emergency of the pre-1820s where you have to build to protect yourself from the cold, the wind, and the rain. You're actually building because you are trying to implement a certain regime of discipline. And you are trying to design space in order to enhance that discipline. The second element is the isolation of inmates, isolation within a continuum from the single cells to some form of separation within these among categories of inmates. So no longer individuals, but sometimes just categories and inmates. And the single cell prison is extremely expensive. And the one prison that actually implemented the single cell prison is the Port Arthur separate prison, where they had single cells. And the idea of course, the confinement of inmates, so they are isolated and they are confined, they're within a closed space, as opposed to the outdoor convict system that was pervasive before the 1820s. They have to be under the continued gaze of a watchman. Now, because there is no central tower, that element is not to be found in any of the panopticons that we have in the special issue. Now, Emily Landman provides us with a beautiful picture here of the inside of the Fremantle jail, where you have the cells on the outside of the building. There is also the jailer's quarters at the same level as the cells, and but you have no central tower. You still have the circular building, but no central tower. You have here a plan of the separate prison. Now, for financial reasons, it was thought that the cross plan was actually more efficient and helped and allowed to house more inmates than the circular panoptic plan. In this particular case, there is no central gaze. You need to walk down the alleys to be able to individually identify what the inmates are doing in the cells. However, from the center of the building, you can actually have a view on the corridors, and that would be a way of controlling the mobility of the inmates within the building in a different way than in Bentham's Panopticon. If you look at the quad, which is the name given to the Aboriginal prison on Rottnest Island. Here you also have a circular shape, probably also to maximize control and visibility and avoid escape. You have to understand in that particular case, in the case of the quad, this was there was no the confinement was only at night, because these were the areas where the Aboriginal inmates would sleep. The work was carried out outside of the quad during the day. I'll come back to this slide later on. So there are two elements. Of course, work is consubstantial of the definition of what a convict is, so it's always present. And in most cases, it's also work that contributes, that is productive, not just work for the sake of working or for the sake of punishment. Information, I think that maybe the phrase maximum extraction of information is maybe slightly over the top. There is some form of reporting, of keeping records of what is going on in these institutions, and this is part of that new penal regime, of which the Panopticon participates, but of course not the only one, both in the silent and the separate system, the systems which were developed in the UK and the US. Of course, reporting and information gathering was part of that new modern way of punishing. Normalizing judgment, that is that you're actually trying to modify the convict's behavior in some way, making him more either more productive, ensuring compliance to rules, modifying the attitude, the behavior of Aboriginal population and communities. All this was part of the new modern way of punishing, which is part of Bentham's purpose here. As there is no central tower, no continued gaze of a watchman, it is a bit difficult to assess whether there was effectively internalization of discipline by inmates. Maybe to a certain extent, but certainly not to the pitch to which Bentham was hoping to implement it. The only structure which can be said to be panoptic, according to Adam Ford, are the airing yards, which can be found in the Melbourne prison, the old Melbourne prison, the Pentridge prison, which was built at a time, which was actually for a very young colony, a grand display of power, wealth and modernity by implementing what they thought or what they considered the latest techniques of punishing. These 5 structures that are being studied in the special issue of the Revue d'études benthamiennes are, to rephrase or reuse a phrase written by Emily Landman, a colonial response to the panoptic model, an adaptation of the colonial model to the particular financial, manpower, intellectual resources at the disposal of the young Australian colonies. I'm going to conclude with a certain number of elements on the birth of the prison, because I believe that today's seminar is actually part of the wider discussion on whether the description of Foucault of the birth of the prison paradigm is accurate. Now, that paradigm, birth of the prison, was created by Foucault in his essay, Surveiller et punir, and in 1975. There were other studies at the same period that reached the same conclusion. So Foucault was not the only academic reaching the conclusion that at the end of the 18th century, in Western Europe, appears a new punishment regime, which involves the mass incarceration, or as Dr. UENO said earlier during his introduction, confinement of individuals, and that Bentham's Panopticon epitomizes that shift away from public display of sovereign power on the convict body towards a more rational, scientific, proportionate use of punishment aimed at disciplining both the body and the mind to cause the convict to reform. Now, this approach by Foucault has been criticized, and especially the studies in the field of global history have been influential in highlighting the gaps and the cracks in Foucault's paradigm. First is the total absence of gender within Foucault's discussion. It is not his focus, it is not his interest. There is also hardly any global conversation in Foucault's birth of the prison paradigm with the non-Western world and with the notion of empire and colonies. There was also work by, and here again, I believe I'm not going to be pronouncing this name properly, Peter Sperenberg, on the prison, who demonstrate that the prison existed before the end of the 18th century and was widespread, and that type of regime existed as from the 16th century in the Netherlands. What is also important is to see from the work that I've done right now, or the seminar that I've just presented, is that the prison model actually coexisted with other punishment systems, which leads us to see that Foucault's viewpoint is white, male, Europeanocentric view of the world. That Foucault ignored the diversity of punishment regimes in Europe and around the world, and that he overstated the importance of the prison in the modern era. It is quite probable that there was, at least in Europe or in the Western world, an increase in a certain type of punishment through confinement or incarceration. But it wasn't at the expense of other type of punishment. And what is particularly interesting is to see the conjunction, the chronology. And at the very time when Foucault identifies in the Panopticon the birth of the prison, and let me remind you that the Panopticon was written in 1786, 1787, at the very time when Foucault identifies birth of a prison in Jeremy Bentham's Panopticon, the first fleet sails from London in 1787 for Australia. So transportation, as I said at the very beginning of my presentation, is clearly not a new phenomenon. But the way in which it is implemented by the British in 1787 is in fact a new form of mobility, an increased form of mobility that creates it's a totally new experiment. And then again, there is the conjunction of these two facts, of a reinvention of the prison at the end of the 18th century and a reinvention of transportation at the end of the 18th century. And both these regimes overlap at that time and will work side by side, because you need to wait for 1868 for the end of transportation to Australia, and for 1947 for the closure of the last penal station in France. Well, not in France, but I don't remember if it's New Caledonia or if it's Guyana, one of the two. I'm sorry about that error. And other forms of penal stations or penal punishment still exist today in the world, with also forms of massive deportation or transportation. So what I'm trying to say now is both the fact that Foucault underestimated the importance of other forms of punishment at the end of the 18th century. But at the same time, if you look at the history, not only of the Australian penal colony, but a lot of other colonies, you will see that transportation, migration, displacement of population will lead at a certain time within these colonies to the building of a constellation of penal establishment. Now, we've only studied Australia, but there are a host of other instances of similar either modernization of prison systems or building of prisons in European colonies all over the world. And it's both taking into account another mode of punishment that is transportation, that is just as important as incarceration, and to see the way in which, even though transportation is a primary punishment, within these spaces there is a place for incarceration again, for the prison. The only difference, I believe, with incarceration in the colonies, or at least in the Australian colony, and incarceration in the metropole, is the interlocking of punishment with migration. There always has been an element of migration within the prison, because the prison implies that people are moved to a new location to be confined in that location. But the flow of people transported from all over the world that ended up in Australia, and then from Australia, they were being confined into these Panopticon, makes migration the very heart of the punishment within these confined areas. And that's also true of the type of migration of Aboriginal populations that are being taken from one part of Australia and dragged to Rottnest Island, which was the only Aboriginal penitentiary in Australia. So the way in which I would conclude, and the last word that I would give for this presentation is the interest, I believe, is identifying the migration and the mobility element within the carceral punishment in Australia, at least. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much for such a wonderful, presentation, which is also very informative for me. Which I found a lot of things I haven't known. So, so let's move on to the comments from two professors from Japan, from Taiwan. So. So first commentator, first discussant is Professor Michihiro KAINO, who teaches, jurisprudence at Doshisha University. So Michihiro-san, please go ahead.
Thank you very much. May I share my file? Or?
Yes, please.
Yes, thank you very much. Yeah, I'd like to thank Hiroki very much for this excellent opportunity, and I also would like to thank Professor Brunon-Ernst for the excellent and profound presentation and papers. And my name is Michihiro KAINO, and I study Bentham in Kyoto, Japan. And I'd like to refer to the fact that Bentham and Australia is a very hot topic in Bentham studies around the world now. And I actually invited Professor Brunon-Ernst to my university in Kyoto, and she gave another excellent paper which shows Bentham's influence on Australia about the greater representative, about forming greater representative government there. And I think Dr. Koza is also attending this seminar, and Dr. Koza and Professor Schofield will, I think, publish another collected works of Bentham in this September, which I saw in the publisher's page. So Bentham and Australia is a very hot topic, and I'd like to ask some questions about Bentham and Australia and Bentham's Panopticon and Australia from Professor Brunon-Ernst's introduction and some other papers. I'd like to skip to Panopticon. Sorry, I wrote Panomion. It's it's a long concept. In the introduction of Revue Etudes Benthamiennes, Professor Brunon-Ernst writes that in these new penal settlements, a disciplinary system based on surveillance, classification, and control, labor, punishment, and rewards, reformation, and education combine the elements of Bentham's panoptic regime in antipodes. So it was very interesting to hear that Professor Brunon-Ernst emphasized that Bentham's idea of surveillance was influential. So I heard Bentham's idea of surveillance was influential. And however, there's a special issue of Bentham around the world in the Journal of Comparative Law, edited by Professor Jai, who is also, I think, present at this seminar. And I wrote about Bentham's Panomion and Japan. And I think Professor Brunon-Ernst referred to Kajibashi prison in, I think it was in Tokyo. But there's another prison which looked like Panopticon in Japan, and I'd like to introduce that. Some criminal lawyers in Japan suggest the influence of Bentham's phenomenon on prison in the Meiji era in early 20th century. Nobushi Hozumi, before becoming a lecturer at Tokyo University, studied in London from 1876 to 1879 at King's College London. And in 1925, Hozumi recalls that when I was studying in Britain around 1870s, I read Bentham's Great Book of Panopticon and felt a need for reformation prisons. The most notable prison in this era was Miyagi Prison in Sendai, which is northern part of Japan, built in 1879. This prison comprised a central tower with 6 annexes, which housed solitary cells. The hexagonal central tower, which was 4-storied building, had cells arranged around the outer wall. And the monitor board was located on the ground floor, which was meant to improve the efficiency of inspections. So this is a Miyagi Prison, which I have just referred. So at first, this prison might have shared the idea of inspection with Panopticon, Bentham's idea of surveillance. But I studied that it was modeled on Belgium's Louvain prison. A government official, Motohiro Onoda, who was in charge of modernizing the prison, observed the condition of the prisons in Europe, and Miyagi Prison was built based on the draft of Louvain Prison. I think Louvain Prison doesn't have any connection with Bentham's Panopticon. So what I'd like to ask Professor Brunon-Ernst is that there seems to have been other models in Europe which pursue the perfection of surveillance. Bentham's idea of Bentham's mode of surveillance was influential. Yes, I think it was influential in Australia, as you say. And his Panopticon were, as you said, incorporated in a unique Australian model, like with extradition. But I think there are many other surveillance models along with Bentham's models. So, and the Japanese prison took the model of Louvain prison. So, why Bentham's Panopticon seems to be so influential in Australia? That's what I'd like to ask first. And I also would like to refer to Professor Llewellyn's paper about Bentham and Australia, and Dr. Koza's paper as well. And I'm very interested in Bentham's influence in Australia, and I think Llewellyn was discussing that there was a general influence of Bentham in Australia, and Dr. Koza is showing an interesting comparison between penal theory of Bentham and McConaughey, which of course Professor Brunon-Ernst referred to. And however, I think I should ask Professor Llewellyn, but Llewellyn in his paper in Review Benthamian introduces that Benthamite contribution to Australia also extended fields such as the construction of local government, education, electoral laws, women's empowerment, and arguably the character of Australian liberalism. In fact, so profound an effect was had by Bentham and his followers that Hugh Collins has referred to Australia as a Benthamite society. And Llewellyn seems to be agreeing with this interpretation. However, Dr. Koza discussed the similarity of Bentham and McConaughey. And McConaughey, in fact, criticized Bentham's theory of punishment. But as I said, and as Dr. Koza shows, there was a similarity of Bentham and McConaughey, and this is because McConaughey's criticism was based on limited reading of Bentham's view on punishment. It is quoted from French version of theory of punishment and recompensation. The second French recensions prepared by Dumont, largely from manuscripts written by Bentham during the 1770s. And I think Professor Schofield also wrote about United States that the works by which Bentham was known in the early 19th century were not those which he himself published in English, such as Defense of Usury and, of course, Panopticon. Did have some success, but Dumont's French recension, Bentham was, the book by which Bentham became famous was Dumont's French recensions. The difficulty in the United States, noticed Bentham, was that very few people were able and willing to read French, or at least to read philosophical works in French. So, although Llewellyn seems to argue that Australia was Benthamite society, it seems difficult to argue that it was so. If I may, adjectures, what is the difference between the situation of the United States and Australia as to the reception of Bentham's thought? Yeah, I would appreciate it if you do answer to these questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for these for pointing out the cracks and the gaps within the special issues and the comments that we've made as Bentham enthusiasts. A couple of things about to answer your last question first. I think that one of the routes by which Bentham thought becomes influential in Australia is through the radicals and radical ideas. So it's not so much Bentham's idea as Benthamite ideas. That is Bentham's thought, which are being distilled and reused as a political platform for extended suffrage, for reform of the poor laws, and we mustn't forget also a certain number of political opponents who were transported to Australia, and these political convicts were either middle class or what we would call working class aristocracy, people who were literate, who were interested in new ideas, who might not have read the books of Bentham, but who might have discussed the ideas of reformist ideas of a certain number of radicals, have heard these ideas as they were rehashed within the framework of political platform, and of course newspapers and the way in which the Edinburgh Review, for example, might have acted as a springboard to circulate ideas, reformist ideas, Bentham's ideas, and ideas of the philosophical radicals more generally. So that would be my my answer to that. I believe Llewellyn makes a convincing argument in listing a certain number of people who were sympathetic to Bentham's ideas. It doesn't mean that Bentham was the only source of their opinions, but at least they were exposed to Bentham's ideas. They had read some of the things that Bentham had written, and they were able to discuss them. Now, to go back to your first series of questions on the Panopticon more particularly, I totally agree with you. There are many different influences in the new penitentiaries that are being built all through the 19th century. And Bentham's influence is only one of many. It was circulated not necessarily through the Panopticon, maybe through the translation into English of Dumont's writing. We know the influence of Dumont's writing in the French-speaking world, but also in the Spanish colony or Spanish-speaking colony in Latin America. That, of course, has nothing to do with Australia, but the circulation of ideas goes through that channel there. And more generally, and there, of course, it's the problem of identifying or pinpointing an influence. There are some acknowledged influence when people say, oh, I'm building a Panopticon. And there are then a certain number of structures in Australia, which are, or penitentiaries in Australia, which are referred to as being Panopticon. And maybe surprisingly enough, the Rottnest Island Quad, which is in fact certainly the structure which functions the less as a Panopticon, because there is no separation, confinement within cells all day long, because people actually only sleep in the cells, is described by both the people who are in there and the people and academics as being a Panopticon, as enforcing some form of Panoptic discipline. So Panopticon, you can see it at different levels. You can either see it at the level of the architecture, and there are very few buildings in the world that actually follow the Panoptic structure of a circle with a central tower. But you can also see it as a whole host of disciplines, which is particular to Bentham, or a new form of punishment, a new regime of punishment. And in that case, it's not so much a Panopticon as Panopticism as identified by Foucault. I hope I have answered your questions, and thank you very much for pointing out this Panopticon, this Japanese Panopticon that I had not, that I did not know of. Thank you very much, Professor KAINO.
Yeah, so thank you very much for your very comprehensive answer. Yes, thank you very much.
Yes, thank you. So I'm just a little bit, conscious of time. So, so please, Brian, and Anne, could you answer just shortly, briefly to Brian's question? I'd like to,
Can you please tell me how much time we've got left?
About 20 minutes. So we want to have some time to discuss freely between, and participants. So Brian, please. So could you turn your mic on, Brian?
Yeah. Oh, yes. Yes. Thanks for Professor M. Brunon-Ernst's very insightful speech and the very inspiring special issue on Bentham and Australia. I learned a lot from your speech, and as Professor Michihiro KAINO says, I think Bentham and Australia, and also the issue of Panopticon is very, very difficult. And I also thank Hiroki for your invitation. If I may, in my discussion today, I would like to focus especially on Bentham's international political theory. As far as I know, I think this theory contains three main components. The first is his theory of international law, and the second is his view on civilization, as discussed in his essay on place and time. And the third is his criticism of colonialism. And these three components are related to each other, but they reveal different dimensions of Bentham's view on the international society. So it is also convenient to separate them for the purpose of analysis. So first of all, regarding Bentham's theory of international law, he states that each nation ought not to pursue the greatest interest of herself, but the greatest and the common utility of all nations taken together. So one reason for this is that this is the way in which each nation will experience least resistance from other nations. And Bentham goes on to argue that, quote, in order to regulate his proceedings with regard to other nations, a given sovereign has no other means more adapted to attain his particular end than setting before his eyes the general end, the most extended welfare of all nations on the earth, quote. So this suggests that in the sphere of international society, Bentham is seeking the identification of interests among different nations, which is an important principle in his theory of constitutional democracy. And moreover, in his A Plan for Universal and Perpetual Peace, he indicates that this plan has two purposes. One is to develop a European system by means of which each nation's force is reduced and fixed. And the other is to the emancipation of distant dependency, i.e. colonies of each state. So in general, Bentham is very critical about colonialism. And in different works, he constantly criticized this practice from economic, political, and the moral perspective to demonstrate his rejection of colonialism. So first, in terms of the economic dimension of colonialism, Bentham rejects the belief prevalent in his time that colonialization is economically beneficial for the mother country because of the lower price of labor and the raw material, and also because of the expansion of market with monopoly. Bentham demonstrates that maintaining colonies is an economic burden for mother countries. So to list three of the reasons, the first is about maintaining colonies demands a lot of capital to be used in the infrastructure of colonies, which would have been devoted to the agriculture or other domestic industry. And in other words, colonialization and the domestic industry are mutually exclusive. And the second, the transportation of materials is expensive. And the third, the administration of colonies, including political establishment and emoluments for troops and officials, are also burdensome. So therefore, instead of monopoly based on colonization, Bentham argued instead for open market and free competition. With regard to the political dimension of maintaining colonies, Bentham stresses the inefficiency of governance caused by distance. Owing to the physical distance between the mother nation and the colonies, it is difficult for governors to realize the need and the feelings of the people in colonies. Thus, he says, to quote, the communication of grievance cannot be too quickly for those from those who feel them to those who have the power to relieve them, to quote. So the anticipated consequence is that people's dissatisfaction will lead to insurrection. And thirdly, in terms of the moral dimension of colonialism, in Bentham's plan for universal and perpetual peace, he appeals to honor publicity and humanity as moral causes for giving up colonies. He argues that the prevalent enthusiasm for colonialism is related to the blind patriotism and the unjust ambition of society. Therefore, the enlightenment of the public is essential for England to realize where its real interest and glory lies. So on the other hand, in Bentham's theory of civilization as revealed in his essay on Place and Time, Bentham's view on the subject is different from J.S. Mill in the sense that he doesn't endorse a hierarchical structure in analyzing different civilizations. And he doesn't hold that the so-called civilized society has right or duty to enlighten the so-called barbarous societies. There are several reasons for Bentham's position. The first is Bentham rejects transplanting the British model of legal system to other societies such as India, because he thinks the system is defective in itself. And this is consistent with Bentham's criticism of English legal and political system in his long career. So in other words, although the principle of utility is applied by Bentham to measure the moral and the political establishment of various society, he does not approve that there exists one single political and moral system derived from this principle, which should be adopted universally. So in this way, Bentham is moral conventionalist, like David Hume. And this is essential to understand Bentham's political philosophy and utilitarian liberalism. For the principle of utility aims to create the greatest happiness of the greatest number, whereas happiness is a feeling of pleasure, the perception of which is conditioned by physical and the social, by physical and the political condition of societies. So furthermore, Bentham's rejection of colonialism is demonstrated in his several important works, including his letters to Spaniards to persuade them to give up Ultramaria. So from Bentham's letters, we find his knowledge of the Spanish liberal constitution in 1812. Bentham's argument is complex and lengthy, but two of his observations are noteworthy. The first is Bentham thinks that it is extremely difficult to secure the permanent submission of Ultramarines. Whenever the Ultramarine resist, it will be very costly for Spanish government to secure peace and order of the local society, and also to preserve his political authority. And the second is Bentham's analysis of Spanish colonialism demonstrate his future view on the issue. Namely, he constantly regards international affairs as the extension of domestic politics. And this is the reason why he thinks that colonialism is taken by politicians as instrument of political corruption. For them, colonialism is an enterprise for them to satisfy their eager for emolument, factitious dignity, and the patronage. So finally, Bentham rejects colonialism in a case of Spain, for that leads to the inconsistency of our constitution. That is to say, even though the Spanish Constitution of 1812 demonstrates its liberal spirit in granting certain civil rights to all citizens, including Ultramarines, but in order to maintain her authority and governance, it is simply unlikely that Ultramarines enjoy equal civil rights with Spaniards. In other words, Ultramarines simply bear the burden of paying tax, but without enjoying any civil rights. So my question for Professor and Brunon-Ernst are as follows. The first is, although Australia are useful to release the crisis of prison in England, would Bentham endorse this project of colonization and regarded it as compatible with the spirit of his plan for universal peace, like European fraternity and universal benevolence. I'm just curious about that. And the second is in Bentham's essays on place and time, he refers specifically to the culture of local community like Formosa and India. He clearly sees the conflict between the practice of colonization and native culture and attempts to reconcile them by preserving the practice of natives. Bentham spent a lot of space explaining the cultural diversity and justify the cultural autonomy by the principle of utility. So I'm just curious if Bentham addressed this question in his reflection on Australia. And the final question is, as mentioned earlier, Bentham thinks that the anti-constitution effect of colonization is that the mother country is unlikely to share equal civil rights with people conquered. So I wonder if Bentham pays attention to this aspect in his writing on Australia. Thank you for your time and patience. That's my presentation and my comments and discussion. Thanks.
Thank you very much for this very interesting presentation of an element that I mentioned at the beginning of my introduction as elements that I would not discuss. So thank you very much, because indeed it is a sequel. It is also very much the context in which the discussion of Bentham's influence on Australia is being assessed. So I'm going to thank you for putting the finger on a certain number of very contentious issues. I have not looked into whether the Australian venture or imperial venture was could be considered as compatible for a plan of universal peace and benevolence in Bentham's mind. However, the closest I can get to an answer would be, first, Bentham wrote extensively on against transportation on account of, and basically citing some of the elements that he would use against colonization. It is costly, it is diverting resources, especially workforce, away from where it is needed, i.e. the metropole. However, later in his life, in end of 1820s, beginning of 1830s, Bentham supported a plan for setting up the new colony of South Australia in his colonization proposal. This is an element, a part or chunk of Bentham's influence on Australia that I would like to study, but I haven't studied yet. So I would say that, as most of Bentham's writing on the colonies, it is ambivalent. So as you can see at the very beginning of his career in the 1780s, 1790s, he is very much opposed to transportation to Australia. However, in the end 1820s, he reassesses, at least in one particular aspect, he actually supports the transportation of free labor to, not the transportation, but, you know, the migration of free laborers to a new colony, the new colony of South Australia. The culture, so question number 2, yes, this is indeed a point that is raised by a certain number of, especially Finch, if I remember well, Professor Finch, in the conference on Bentham and Australia. And what she says is that there is a total quasi-absence of interest for Aboriginal communities in Australia. Now, the reason is Bentham never went to Australia, and his only knowledge of Australia comes from David Collins' writings and his knowledge of the Aboriginal communities, and his assessment of the Aboriginal culture comes from a very disparaging comments made by Collins. So Bentham got the impression that Aboriginal people were not occupying the land as such. They didn't have a culture that was worth protecting. They had no government. They had no institutions. No. The answer to your question, no, there is no interest for the culture of and the protection of the culture of local community and local customs, because for Bentham, from his understanding of of reading Collins and of speaking to Collins, because he meets Collins David Collins in London too, 3 or 4 times, and he dines with him. What he understands is that there are no institutions, and as such, the problem is Bentham writes at a time before the invention or the making of anthropology, and of course, because of that, he has no understanding that you can have. Maybe I'm overstretching it, but maybe he has no understanding that there can be a culture even if there are no institutions, and there is no institution, there is no government, doesn't mean there isn't a culture. Third question, now because the Aboriginal communities, the indigenous communities, were dismissed from participation within the settlers' community. They were pushed away from the settlers' community, or if they were integrated within the settlers' community, they were not necessarily given or granted the same rights as, at least the same practical right, maybe the same theoretical rights, but not necessarily the same practical rights as effective rights as settlers. And because of that, you have a community in Australia, which is very much settler community, which is very much different from the settler community in India, where it's a very crowded place with its own institution, and where settlers are in fact little islands, as I understand it. I haven't studied India, but little islands of powers of settlement within a very structured community or communities in India. So the expectation of people in India and of white settlers in India is not necessarily the same as in Australia. And remember, all through, well, from the 1820s, 1840s onwards, in the theory of empire, what you have is a great distinction between the white colonies and the other colonies. And Australia was a white colony, and to the same extent as Canada was a white colony, even though you also had indigenous populations in Canada to the same extent that you had in Australia. So the rights and the way in which people had rights and considered that they had birthrights as British born, it was very much felt by the population and very much part of the demands in seeking for more representative governments and for a more equal standing with the metropole. I hope this answers your question, and thank you very much for pointing these elements.
Thank you.
Thank you for the discussion. While we are almost running out of time, but you know, this is just a, you know, virtual conference from which you can leave whenever. So if you have other additional time, and we can keep this room open, so that other participants can make comments and questions. So would my plan sound okay? And you have other.
No. I've got nothing else. No worries.
Okay. So let's discuss with other participants. So Paul, you have a first question. Paul is from Yonsei University, Korea.
Yep. Thank you very much. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. Yeah, actually, it's kind of building on the last point where you made some kind of connections, comparing, contrasting with other, British imperial sites, other, shall we say, colonial sites and sort of distinctions across race and settlement patterns and so forth. And I guess this is reflecting my own sort of lack of knowledge of Australian history, I have to confess. But perhaps making some connections and parallels, South Asia, and he went on to talk about things like, Canada. And my question, I guess, simply put, is about intersections or relationships, parallels, concerns with education. Because it sounded like to me, I don't know much about figures like McConaughey and the Marx system and so on, but as far as I know, I've done a little bit of work on kind of connected to what is often called the monitorial system of education, or the Madras system of education that was kind of developed in late 18th century India. Interestingly, basically institutionalizing biracial children of East India Company troops and servants and so on in Madras, what would be modern day South India, Chennai, Tamil Nadu. And then it was brought back to Britain, and it became very, this would be something I wouldn't expect the denominational affiliations to be appealing to Bentham, but there were kind of rival systems of the Anglican, the national kind of attempts to promote under the Church of England, a kind of school system, and then sort of dissenting systems. But a lot of it was very similar to what I understand in my brief reading about McConaughey and some of the things that you touched on, because it was basically, here you are, we have a little book, a black book. We record, the bad marks and the good marks. And so there's a system of kind of rewards and punishment. But I guess I'm being a little bit long-winded. I wonder, in the transportation, how much, what were the ages? You talked a little bit about kind of gender and other aspects, and, like the typical being a sort of, adult male, urban dweller, London or whatever. I wonder what proportion of people were there, for example, in, early teens, something like that. And were there related kind of parallel attempts to kind of set up and institutionalize education that may have involved similar types of, elements of kind of coercion and reward? So I guess you get what I'm saying, kind of links between the sort of punitive convict prison systems and education system, because it would seem to me that I think a lot of scholars recently have been paying attention to that, not just in sort of specialized fields like history of education, but looking at as well some of those kind of colonial aspects. One thinks of, you mentioned people like Pitts, but back in the 90s to 2000s, the broader currents of inverted commas liberalism and liberal thought and empire. Uday Mehta's very influential book on liberalism and empire, and it seems to me, obviously, Bentham had lots of connections and many different types of thinkers, and the sort of, I think what you pointed towards with the circulation of people, the circulation of ideas and models, you see that actually in the South Asian case. Mehta talks about that kind of things coming back from the colonial context in India, but also recent scholars, and there's an interesting literature scholar in the US, Sari Makdisi, that has a book a few years ago called something like Making England Western. you know, he talks a lot about, and he talks about figures like who I've done a little bit of work on, a Scottish magistrate in London, Patrick Cahoon, who's involved in sort of, you know, prevention of crime, preventive policing, and kind of advocating for these kind of educational systems targeted at the poor, right, to basically prevent crime through systems of, you might say, sort of kind of reward / coercion. Sorry, that's a bit of a long-winded phrasing, but
yeah, no, just to Patrick Cahoon was a friend of Bentham.
I believe so. Yes.
Yeah, and they did work together on the hard labor bill at the end of the 18th century. So yes, you've got common ideas there, and common purpose of trying to tackle crime. I do not have an answer to your question. I have a certain number of strands of routes of investigation that might help. Now, children convicts. There were children convicts. I don't have the numbers.
Right.
But there were children convicts. They're both within as primary offenders and re-offenders. At Port Arthur, there was a peninsula, a small island, in fact, within the harbor of the Port Arthur penal station, and which housed children, exclusively children, and it was called Port Puer, P-U-E-R, and they're called the Puer children. And from what I believe, it was it is now presented as a place of horrendous abuse, as you might expect.
Yeah.
So they were just like, they were like a 5-minute boat trip from the main station, but they were isolated from the rest. So an idea maybe here, that something you can draw out of that, the idea of isolation, confinement, and the idea that they need to be separated also from the main body of adult convicts. What we read from the first years of the colony, and that's up to the 18, the main shift is the 1820s, when you start, building, separating, classifying, putting people away, in Sydney, for example, and that's when you start having institutions that look after young girls, young boys, educate them, also trying to target and educate Aboriginal populations and children. Something also extremely important, the way in which some of these Aboriginal children were being adopted, taken within, as from the very beginning, settlers' families in order to be...
That's what I was kind of thinking, because obviously when you're pointing towards some of the Commonwealth cases like Canada, obviously notoriously residential school systems for Indigenous children, and children being taken from their family and their sort of, their own culture and placed with, white colonial settler, whatever you want to call it, families. So I wonder if there's some kind of similar parallels there in terms of kind of what you might call kind of acculturation and being taught languages and culture or whatever of the kind of Anglo-colonial community.
It's really not my field of specialty, and I haven't looked into it, but from what I've read, and little things that I kind of remember from what I read, yes, of course, there's from the beginning of 1900, 1920s, but maybe I don't have the exact date, you have these stolen children. So really taking the children, Aboriginal children, away from their parents, taking them and just huge migration and mixing of people from different families, different tribes, different cultures, Aboriginal, different languages. and sending them to other parts of Australia and trying to re-educate them, and westernize them as much as possible. But not at the time when I'm speaking, not in the 19th century. Now the roots are there in the sense that there was really an attempt at educating them, but from what I've read at that time, not taking them forcibly away from their parents in order to re-educate them in institutions. They would be day institutions rather, or they'd be placed as workers or servants within settlers' family, sometimes adopted as children, but full-fledged children, not put into institutions. So but that's the very beginning. And same thing, turning point of institutions, 1820, you start having these institutions that cater for education, because appalling stories for the very early stages of the colonies, where children running around uneducated, illiterate, thieving, sometimes they're without their parents because either the parents are reoffender or the parents are in Britain and they're just there on their own. So yeah, interesting things. I haven't looked into it and I'm really sorry, but there are some interesting things there to work on. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, is there any question? So Brian and Michihiro, do you have any additional comment, final comment to?
No.
No. Michihiro-san. Okay.
Yes, yes, of course. No. First Brunon-Ernst's answer was comprehensive, so I don't have more question. Yeah,
okay. So shall we finish this session? Thank you so much for your brilliant lecture, as well as I'd like to say thank you to Brian and Michihiro for your very insightful comments and discussions. So thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Very stimulative
Thank
talks.
you,
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, so see you. Good night.
Good night. Bye.
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 Professor Chen. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Dr. Wynn. Bye.
Thank you for your presentation.